Great. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Gregory, and it's my pleasure to chair the second in our new series of Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy lectures. This is a new series, and Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy, you may or may not know, is an informal grouping of people with particular interests in this field. That includes the Centre for Science, Technology and Policy, the Policy Links Unit in IFM, and the Babbage Forum, among several others. But we find that industrial innovation, as distinct from innovation more broadly, it is a rather narrower and focused interest of some people and doesn't have perhaps a natural forum for discussions of this kind. So the format is that in this case, Lord David Willetts will talk to us for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. The rules of engagement, if you please, are to use the Q&A. It's a bit tricky when we have a relatively large audience to let everybody come on screen, so I hope you don't mind not being on the telly. But if you send in the Q&A, I'll do my best to read them out faithfully and just muck about with them if there are similar questions which can perhaps be conflated. Now, there's never been a better time to be thinking about industrial policy, given the turbulence going on locally, nationally and internationally. We could hardly have a more distinguished speaker than Lord David Willetts. Among many other things, he's chairman of the Resolution Foundation. He was Science Minister, following in fact Lord Sainsbury, our last speaker, and has taken a passionate interest in education. He's also chairman of the Foundation for Science and Technology, and is more accustomed to being on this side of the camera rather than the other side. So we're delighted that we can do it to him rather than him doing it to us, if you see what I mean. The theme David has kindly agreed to speak about is what are the ways that we should structure intervention, if that's not a dirty word, in industrial innovation. So the floor is yours, David.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mike, for the invitation to join your group. It's a pleasure to be with you. It would have been, of course, even more of a pleasure if we'd been able to physically meet and have dinner at Churchill, but who knows what might be possible as gradually lockdown eases. So let me just take you through about 10 slides, which try to set a framework for our discussion this evening. And let's move on to the first slide, please, which is a quotation that really is emblematic of a debate we have had in Britain now for over 100 years. This is an observation at the beginning of the First World War that in Germany, because science there has been more thoroughly and effectively applied to the solution of scientific problems bearing on trade and industry, that we discovered as we went into the war that Germany had a technological and industrial lead over us. That was the moment of truth. And of course, that observation in the government report of 1915 in turn led to the creation of the structure of a Department for Scientific and Industrial Research that in turn operated for nearly 50 years until it was replaced by the structure of research councils in the 1960s, which themselves operated for about 50 years until we got UKRI as an umbrella over the research council. So this was the point at which Britain, for the first time, started trying to pursue innovation to catch up with the Germans. But even more than 100 years on, we still have problems. I believe the empirical evidence is overwhelming that whatever the quality of our upstream research, applying it to industry, applying it, commercializing it or using it in some other way for public benefit is still a problem for us. If you come to the next slide, you will see, I think there are three structural reasons for this in the way in which we do policy in government and Whitehall. This is a distillation from my own experience as science minister of some of the problems I became increasingly aware of, even when I was doing my own bit to try to tackle the issue. The first is, we're rather proud of having dual funding, by which we mean we have the patient funding that goes to universities through QR, which is the assessment of research excellence, which in turn gives substantial allocations of funding, about 2 billion a year to our universities, and of course, Cambridge prominent amongst them. And that's, if you like, fundamental institutional funding. And then we have research council funding, which is often more project related. Although calling it the dual funding model makes it sound as if it covers all the angles, it's got a strand of patient funded and a strand of project funding. What it misses out is patient funding of non-university institutes. The research councils have a small number, a very small number that have a long-term life. And in Cambridge, the Laboratory of Molecular Biology is a conspicuous and rare example. But the dual funding model means there is not the equivalent of QR funding for a wide network of national laboratories, which could have been business facing, as they are, for example, in Germany. That's the first issue. Secondly, the great Rothschild inquiry into research back in the 1970s crystallized a model which has been, where he assumed that there would be, on the one hand, a science budget. And of course, that's where the Haldane principle comes in, the principle that ministers don't intervene in exact projects and don't decide exactly what should be researched. There's a high level of autonomy for the science community, and so it should be. And then he thought that departments would have their own R&D budgets, which would be the kind of the government's applied budget, which would be spent on doing things that solve problems and policy issues that departments were concerned about. But the period in the 50 years since Rothschild, what we have seen is, I'm afraid, departments acting like classic short-term companies, where when they're under departmental pressure, one of the first things to go is the R&D budget. And we've only really got two serious R&D budgets left in health, and to some extent, those shrinking in the Ministry of Defense. And when you look at America and elsewhere, you find one of our great omissions, therefore, is that we don't have a large departmental spend on the application of research, the problems that are relevant for departments. And then thirdly, our universities count as part of the private sector, thank heavens. Universities are not in the public sector. They don't have all the rules on salaries or appointments. They may occasionally feel that they are over-regulated and over-pressured, but I tell you, they're not public sector institutions. However, our national labs, such as they are, and there aren't many of them, are within the public sector. And that means that Cabinet Office pay rules apply, procurement rules apply. It means that if you've really got a star researcher that you wish to recruit from abroad, a university is far more likely to be able to pay him or her an internationally competitive rate than a public sector research establishment. If you put those three things together, you begin to see why the British structure is not one that favors the application of research in an industrial context. It means that we're weak on the network of labs, business facing, perhaps sponsored by big departments, which they have both in the US and they have in Germany. And the evidence for this is in the next slide, please. And in the next slide, and this comes from my book, A University Education, is a breakdown of how we spend our R&D budget. Now, of course, first of all, there's the embarrassing fact that our total R&D spend, and this is both public and private, at 1.7% of GDP is significantly below some of our competitors. The government has the objective of raising it to 2.4% of GDP, which would be fantastic if we can achieve that. So it's low. And when you look at the components of the 1.7, you can see our business spend is unfortunately rather low on R&D. If you look at the higher education R&D spend, however, you find that we are broadly comparable with our competitors. And then if you look at our government R&D spend, which is public spend on R&D outside universities, that's where we are proportionately furthest behind. So what we've ended up with, probably more by accident than design, may have been a rational strategy in a world where R&D was relatively low, which is we've put a lot of our eggs in one basket, namely higher education. And this is, and with that money, our universities do a fantastic job. But the bits of the system which really are laggards are business and government. That's where the problem lies. And this focus on universities, and again, I mean, I admire what they do, has led to some of the distinctive features of the British model, as I summarize them in the next slide. And what this slide shows is, first of all, it's very high on autonomy. Universities are autonomous bodies. The science budget is relatively autonomous. So it's a model that focuses on handing out money to upstream scientific research. It's not so focused on application. We don't have application-focused labs on a large scale, and departmental applied budgets are relatively modest. So we are focused more on autonomy than on application. Because it's focused on universities, our universities then respond to all the classic incentives, and we know how you are rewarded in a university environment. It's for prestigious research, high quality research in prestigious journals at the frontiers of a discipline. And again, that's great. It's just not the whole story. But we really are, because of putting so much of our budget into the university environment, we've in turn putting it into an environment where those are the incentives for the type of research you do, which in turn means, put all that together, it's bad for innovation. So in the latter half of my talk, I want very briefly to go through some of the things we could do to try to change these incentives, and then end with a brief reflection on technology. So if we go to the next slide, please. The first thing to do would be to say, all right, we've given so much of this funding goes into our universities. Perhaps let's try to change the incentives there to broaden the focus on research with impact in universities and research that can be practically applied. And here are three suggestions, what we might do. First of all, I actually think counting startups is a very bad way of measuring innovation and industrial innovation. It's great when there's a startup that flourishes. I think we push too many lab projects into the formula of being a startup company and push that startup company out into the commercial world. We have a lot of fledglings that should be left in the nest for a bit longer, that are pushed out long before they're really able to fly. So if anything, we have an excessive number of startups, some of them too vulnerable really to succeed, really academic research projects dressed up. I also think, and this is aimed more at Oxford than at Cambridge, some universities take excessive stakes in the companies that they have created as startups and spin-outs. And again, I think that's a misunderstanding of the role of the university. The role of the university is not to make a lot of money by IP protection, it's to create a wider innovation environment. And if a spin-out startup does prove to be a great success, one hopes that the creators will put some money back. MIT makes more money from the sale of its t-shirts than it does from the value of equity stakes in companies. It has license income, but it doesn't focus quite so much as we do on the idea that there's a fantastic winner out there, and the university needs to keep a high proportion of it. And then I'm also rather skeptical about requiring all researchers to be submitted to the REF, which I think spreads the monoculture. Now, a rather prestigious monoculture of focusing on a certain sort of high quality research. It does mean that applied research for a regional economy, for example, tends to lose out. So there's things you could do for universities. That's the first list. Carrying on with the list, if we go to the next slide, there are things we could do to ensure the success of applied research outside universities. Beginning with the obvious point, if there is more money coming, as we must hope there is, I would like to see more public funding going into Catapults and other non-university research institutes. And look, I created the Catapults post-2010. It was a very happy coincidence that George Osborne and I, in opposition in the shadow cabinet, commissioned James Dyson to do a report for us on how we could promote innovation. And he looked at German Fraunhofers and said, we should pursue such a program here. And meanwhile, Hermann Hauser, the estimable Hermann Hauser of Cambridge, of course, was producing a report that Peter Mandelson, the then Secretary of State, commissioned. And Hermann also recommended something based on the German Fraunhofer. So we had the happy accident in 2010 of both Labour and Conservative having received very similar proposals. And we implemented them with the creation of our network of catapults that are now performing very well. Germany has 61 Fraunhofers. We've now got about 10 catapults. I would like to see them slowly, gradually growing. And there are other ways you can do non-university research institutes as well. So that's one thing you can do. You can give greater freedom to public sector research establishments. And this was a repeated theme in my visits to the LMB and others, give them greater freedoms. We could do harness public procurement. I'm looking for ways in which we get that focus on applied R&D, the sort that you'd have if there were large departmental R&D programs, perhaps use the infrastructure budget for that. And of course, speaking now as a board member of UKRI, try to improve the way in which we at UKRI conduct our business. So there are things you can do beyond universities. Let's now move on to the next slide, to the crucial agency, Innovate UK. And Mike mentioned in his opening that he said that David Sainsbury had been your previous speaker. Well, I have enormous respect for David and what he did as science minister. And one of the things which he did do as science minister was create the Technology Strategy Board. We renamed that Innovate UK. I sometimes think that was a mistake of mine. Technology is now so hot. I wonder if we should just have kept it as the Technology Strategy Board. And the fact is that for the last few years, the Innovate UK has had its budget, I think, quite unnecessarily constrained. And a lot of its specific programs have been reduced. I would like to see specific technology programs. They could even be programs for technologies in places brought in. There are some of those under the industrial strategy, which is excellent, the challenge funds, but we might be able to have some specific technology programs run by Innovate UK. It's got one main funding stream left, the Smart Awards, which is its responsive mode funding for innovation. That's what industry above all is aware of as the public money to support it. And last time I checked, it was sadly running at a success rate of about 10%. If you apply, you had a 10% chance of getting an award. That was not because 90% of the applications were of poor quality. It was because there was a cash constraint, and proposals which otherwise would have been funded were not able to be funded because of cash constraints. And that is incredibly frustrating. And it also creates a vicious spiral when people think, oh, Innovate UK can't be any good. Look, they don't understand the value of my proposal. They turned down my grant application. They really don't get it, which the answer is yes, they probably did get it, but we're not able to find the money to fund it. And then, of course, and this is an exciting development where the world really is now beginning to move, I think linking up Innovate UK, the British Business Bank, and the British Growth Fund, Business Growth Fund run by our main banks, to create more aligned funding on the full journey throughout into the commercial marketplace is something else that we could do. So put all that together and you get 10, there are 10 policy proposals, and any member, any distinguished participant in this discussion is very welcome to criticize any one of them, provided you suggest a substitute which is better. So because this is, I'm not saying this is the last word, but I'm very keen to hear your practical suggestions for other things we might do. Let me just end very briefly with the next slide, next couple of slides, actually just looking particularly to technologies, which I know are of great interest to industry. And there is still a bit of a hang up you find in some quarters. Can we really back technologies? Is that picking winners? Do we know enough about what's going on? Isn't the real thing to do missions and challenges? And I've had this discussion over months and years with my friend, Mariana Mazzucato, for whose work I have great admiration and who's the advocate of missions, and hence the language of moonshots. But I always say, look, when President Kennedy went literally for the first great moonshot of getting a man on the moon, he wasn't sitting around randomly in the White House saying, it wouldn't be nice if we sent a man to the moon. It was only possible because there was prior investment in Saturn V rockets. They were already being developed. A technology was being developed before a precise mission was identified. So Mariana and I agree that, yes, it's great to have missions, provided they are complemented by matching funding in underlying technologies so that you have a repertoire of opportunities from which you can select your missions. Missions without prior investment in technologies won't get you very far. I do think you can do horizon scanning to identify what is happening to technology in the future. some people think that if you put money into technologies, you're somehow just backing big companies. And there's always a lively debate as to what extent innovation, industrial innovation, comes from existing large players who can afford substantial R&D budgets, of course, and to what extent it comes from new players arriving on the scene. Some of the great innovations come from the newcomers and may be hard for the established players to promote because it cannibalizes their own business. It requires excessive changes in how they work and what they do. That's why I think general purpose technologies are actually inherently disruptive. One of the other things that I always say, especially to my friends in politics who think this is all terribly illiberal and interventionist, and why on earth would a conservative government want to do it, is it's what the Americans do, including under Republicans in Congress and in the White House. Indeed, for the Americans, their technology strategy is their security strategy. They clearly have a security strategy which involves being a world leader in every major new technology. That's part of how they maintain their position as a superpower. Americans are clearly focused on identifying early stage general purpose technologies and promoting them to them on the long journey through to the marketplace. They continue to fund them to the market, whereas in Britain, we historically stop sooner and expect the market to come in before it's really ready to do so. And the Americans understand that. They take their startup technologies closer to market than we do in Britain. And then finally, and this is the new angle, which I would have observed, especially in the last year or two, and is promoting leading a lot of Whitehall interest in technology. And that is quite simply the security imperative. And in fact, it was I'm pretty sure it was a Cambridge entrepreneur who said to me ruefully a few years ago, he was researching on an exciting new technology. And he couldn't get public funding for it because the Treasury doctrine was that the government couldn't possibly know which technologies were really going to be successful in the marketplace or not, and it wasn't their job to assess it. But he got the security agencies all over him who were absolutely terrified he might sell it to the Chinese, and they absolutely understood its value and were determined not to let it go to a rival power. And that debate, I have to say, is increasingly being won by the security agencies who say, look, these are key technologies. We've got to back them. We can't just have a free-for-all. And so a lot of the horizon scanning that's now done is done by coming from the security side. A lot of the new interventions, the Strategic Industrial Innovation Fund, those kind of innovations are driven by a desire to have some technology sovereignty, as Hermann Hauser would call it. So there's increasingly a security imperative as well. I think now, we may turn later on to a discussion of key technologies, but I think what we better do, if we just go on to the next slide and then the final slide after that. This is just a very brief summary of some of the possible technologies that people might want to regard as key ones. I'd be very interested to hear your views on that. And then finally, we've got if you turn to the next slide after this, please, a shameless plug for my book on universities, but which includes chapters discussing the very issues that I've tried to identify in this talk. So I look forward to your comments and questions. Over to you.
David, that was absolutely smashing. Thank you very much indeed. We'll launch in, I think, with the questions, because people don't want to hear me wittering on. The first one is from Dmitry Plekhanov, and picking up the examples of what other people are doing. He writes, research commercialization is a tremendous challenge for many countries. To what extent challenges of the UK in research commercialization are different from the challenges of other developed, e.g. US and Germany, and from catching up countries?
Yeah, that's a very good question. America is different because America is big enough to have a strategy that America will be a global leader in all major technologies, which means that Britain faces, as a medium-sized economy, faces a problem of having to choose, which is more acute than the one they face in America. That's why the Treasury get more anxious, because they know resources are limited. So what do you do? I think, as I say, I think it's an inevitable result of our size. You have to choose. And then the other comparison that you asked about is Germany. If you look at there's a marvelous kind of Elsevier cobweb of research performance in different disciplines, the field weighted average performance, and what it shows, citations and impact. And the shape of the British cobweb is quite even. It's quite a round circular cobweb, which tells you we have research performance above the global average in a very wide range of disciplines. Germany's is a bit more skewed than ours. So our problem of specialization is even worse than what we are very unusual as a medium-sized economy, not having a highly skewed ComWeb from which you could say, they're fantastic at engineering, but hopeless at social science, or really good at life sciences, but not so good in physical sciences. If there was that kind of clear message, it would make the formulation of policy, oddly enough, easier. But our cobweb is so well distributed that it doesn't tell a policymaker where to focus down. So yes, that makes some of these issues more acute in the UK.
Thank you. Great. I now have a question from an anonymous attendee, but the nature of the question may suggest where that attendee is lurking. Public sector research establishments have finally, 5 years after the Paul Nurse's recommendation, are now eligible to compete for Research Council funding. When will the Catapults be allowed to compete on the same basis as other institutes such as TWI?
Yes, and look, that is, though I say it myself, it's one of the issues on which I have campaigned, and also Patrick Vallance did a very important report in this area. So I am very pleased that we have made some progress with PSREs. I mean, Catapults have got a distinctive funding formula, and when money is tight, and we still are on 1.7% of GDP, it's hard to continue to broaden the range of eligibility. But Catapults do get core funding from Innovate UK, together with, of course, funding from the private sector. But yes, it would be great in a world where they were also able to do it, but you would probably, it's the kind of thing you would only really be able to contemplate if budgets were significantly larger than they are now.
Fair enough, and I'm sure the anonymous attendee isn't lurking anywhere in the Catapult system. I have a question from Carlos Lopez Gomez. Hello, Carlos. Would a departmental RD budget at Bays make it easier to support application of research in industry? And he also goes on, thank you for highlighting the fact that startups are not the same as innovation. What KPIs for universities could help change this perception and support innovation?
Yes, that's a very interesting, in a way, Innovate UK is the Bays applied research agency. Innovate UK is part of Bays. Of course, it's now also part of UKRI, but it's the agency which Bays can use for those purposes, and hence it's ended up as managing a lot of the industrial strategy money. It manages the Catapults. If a minister really wanted to support research in industry, it is the agency you would go to do that. So I wouldn't want to create. There is a bit of Bays R&D budget, because there's a certain number of Bays research institutes institutes that do research that are not part of UKRI, the Met Office, for example. But yeah, most of it would go through Innovate UK. And then seeing Carlos's question, yes, it's good. We're in agreement that startups are not the same as innovation. What KPIs for universities? Well, I think down the track it would be things like graduates in knowledge transfer networks and doing knowledge transfer activity, the scale of industries, the scale of the firms involved. You could have patent activity, but you include patents by your previous graduates. And he asked about procurement as well. Yeah, I'm a fan of SBRI, but it's been very hard to get it to work on anything like the scale of the US. That's why I added the suggestion of something out of the infrastructure budget, because SBRI is good, but still sadly far too small compared with the US.
Great, thank you. And now Rich Walker. In the same vein, really, one challenge at present is that startup scale-ups are encouraged to take equity investment, which inevitably leads to a pressure to exit, usually a trade sale to a large corporate. And we see a lot of that around Cambridge, of course. Now, how can we encourage businesses to scale without sale while still providing support models?
Yeah, well, this is the key challenge. And of course, Sherry Cooter and others have done such excellent work on the scale-up challenge. There are a couple of points which were sort of buried in what I said earlier, but I probably didn't bring out their implications. One is better, more imaginative public sector procurement. It is a public sector contract is a marvelous form of non-dilutive finance that enables a company to grow. And still a lot of departments are very cautious and wary of procuring from companies that are already being funded by Innovate UK. So doing better on public procurement. And then the other thing is, that is why I mentioned British Business Bank and Business Growth Fund. Business Growth Fund, which was initially created by the banks after 2010, almost, because they'd misbehaved so badly and led to the financial crash. This was their kind of parking fine for, I think they rather grudgingly put a few $100 million in and wrote it off as well. That's what we've got to do to keep the politicians happy. But a business growth fund I think is now turning into a really exciting proposition and has shown to banks that there were, in the different regions of the UK, some quite exciting, rapidly growing companies that probably the banks would not otherwise have spotted and would not otherwise have been willing to fund. And it's becoming a kind of successor to 3i. So those are some of the ways in which companies can be viable without going straight to a trade sale.
Carlos, is allowed a second question, which is in the same vein. That's why I'm allowing him a second bite at the cherry. And it is this business of scale up, which I'm a big enthusiast for. It seems to me quite apart from the need for funds to enable you to scale up, there are some technologies and operational capabilities associated with the business of scale up, which we don't really understand terribly well. But Carlos asks, what can be done to ensure that the scale up of future industries is a priority in government? You've touched on that, but a little more perhaps, if you would.
Yeah, and actually, look, as I said, I would say the interesting thing is the way in which the security agencies and this idea of technology sovereignty that Herman Hauser has written about, they are definitely having an impact. And if you look at what has happened in the last year, well, just over a year ago, we've had two important initiatives. The National Security Industrial Innovation Fund, run out of the British Business Bank, which has, if you go to its website, a list of the key technologies in which it wishes to invest. And this is basically driven by the view we want some of these companies to stay in the UK. We don't want to lose them all from the UK. And then secondly, currently going through Parliament, well, it may just have completed its process through Parliament, for the first time, a massive change in the UK takeover regime, so that takeovers in a range of key sectors and technologies can be called in for investigation and assessment if there's a fear that they will also lose a loss of UK capability in key areas. That's a pretty big change of thinking in just over a year. So as I say, paradoxically, I would say one of the biggest changes in technology policy since my time has been the arrival of the security agencies. In my time, I was very focused on technologies. There was then I have to say, sadly, 2 or 3 years when funding for Innovate UK was cut back and the old Treasury doctrine, how can we possibly know if any technology is worth investing in, became more powerful again. And the security agencies in the last couple of years have brought us back to a recognition that these technologies are worth funding. And I think now there's a prospect that they will have a more attention again.
Great. And we'll let Rich Walker have a second question because it's an interesting one, and one you touched upon, David, which is currently public labs have a propensity to hoover up funding that would otherwise go to SMEs. For example, in innovation funding from large organizations. What would you do about it?
I wasn't really aware of this issue. I'm not, that is, that's not quite clear. Hoovering up this, I can sense there's maybe a bit of a personal experience and perhaps a grievance about hoovering up funding that otherwise go to SMEs. I personally would say that PSREs have been relatively ill-funded by the public sector. So maybe the argument here is that the way they get money is instead by going to large commercial organizations to fund them, which in turn diverts them from SMEs. That is possible. But I would need a further intervention by Rich Walker to educate me more on that. It's an interesting angle, but not one I've got a good answer on.
Well, we'll ask Rich to drop a note on the Q&A if you'd like to do that. Rich, you've got an open opportunity to have another round at that one if you would like. I'm going to nip forward a little bit to a more general question, which is a bit of a chestnut, but it remains important. Daniel Hook asks, do you fear that an increasing focus on the impact in university contexts may lead to universities focusing on short-term rather than long-term technological innovations at the same time that the private sector are beginning to focus on long-term innovation? And will that cause an unhealthy switchover between the public and private sectors? Companies such as DeepMind are not bound to create open research outputs.
Yes, I think that the impact in universities is of mixed value, trying to measure it. And look, I'll tell you a story. I think now it's so far deep in history that I can share it with you. So we were in danger in 2010 of having some really quite big cuts in the science budget. And I went back to George Osborne and the Chancellor and said to them, the department may have agreed to these cuts, but they would be very bad. I kind of asked them, implored them not to do it because science mattered so much. And George and the Treasury agreed. They did a last minute rethink. And we got flat cash. Could have been worse, but it could have been better, but we got flat cash. Oh, I can still remember, well, after I'd got the news that on a Sunday of the final round of the public spending negotiations, yes, we have granted you flat cash. They said, and you'll get tomorrow morning our conditions. And the conditions that the Treasury attached to flat cash, one of them was measuring impact in universities and the impact factor in the ref. That was part of the deal. The Treasury would not agree the money unless there was that impact factor. And there have been various attempts at getting impact in, and I'd be interested in people's views on that. And certainly academics shouldn't be inventing impact when their research is driven by genuine intellectual curiosity, and it may well have an impact in the future, but it can't be predicted. DeepMind, however, I think is a different example. I have mixed views of DeepMind being sold to Google. There is a view that Scaleup and DeepMind are the two great British technology companies that got away. Scaleup now, of course, being part of Illumina, and DeepMind being part of Google. And I have said this to friends of mine in DeepMind. They come back with the following observation, that the computing power that they get to use every year provided by Google, if you were commercially paying for it, would itself cost somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion a year. So they say to me, can you actually imagine a UK funding model that would have made that kind of resource available? So the truth is that these big American technology companies have such deep pockets that they can fund research and activity on a scale that is very hard for the UK to match. And as you rightly say, that is a problem. Is sometimes the stuff is all in the private sector. How much machine learning work is really being done inside Google, rather than in the sort of the Alan Turing Institute? And the power and capacity of Google to do it is massive compared with Turing. But that's just a fundamental resource issue.
A question, and as apparently Chow En Lai said, although this may be apocryphal, when asked about the French Revolution, had it been a success, he's alleged to have said it was too soon to say. And maybe this question is in the same category, but Chris Courtney of UKRI asks, how can the new ARIA work differently in the area in terms of commercializing general purpose technologies?
Well, by the way, there is one argument what Chow En Lai thought the question was about the French riots of 1968. So there is which is relevant, because we think, the Chinese are always our superior. So that there is a view that this is a misunderstanding, or piled on a misunderstanding. Who knows?
Fascinating.
The ARIA could do this, and I think that would be true to its origins as ARPA-DARPA. That's, as we know, how the Americans originally used that agency, particularly used to strategic defense requirements, and with a direct pull-through via procurement. A successful DARPA project would then be procured by the DoD, lead to procurement by the DoD. I think using it to reinforce our investment in technology would be a great focus for ARIA. Of course, you then need to ensure some alignment with Innovate UK. You don't want to have, two agencies doing something similar. So you'd need to have some agreement as to who did what. But yes, I think that would be a great thing for ARIA to do. Great.
I'd like to hop to another question from Dmitry Plekhanov, which will be of interest to quite a few people on this session, I think. Does your recent book address the precariat of research careers? Maybe the US is doing better in that regard than some other nations?
Well, I do discuss briefly the character of the university, and I am aware of this issue. I don't have a full analysis or proposals of it in my book. Of course, the book is worth getting for other reasons. The dilemma, look, I wrestled with this dilemma. The dilemma was that we did expand our doctoral program, and I thought the centers for doctoral training were good, and we built business relationships with them, and we expanded our doctorates. But we didn't, and they were the base of a pyramid, if you like, which was still obviously very narrow at the top. And so we had then a lot of postdocs rushing around under enormous competitive pressure, probably the toughest stage of a research career, trying to find some permanent post. And the fact is that I think all of us, and I'd include myself in this, didn't level enough with people doing doctorates, saying doctorates don't automatically lead to research careers in academia. There are many more doctorates now than there are research vacancies for these careers. So you may feel you're on an automatic track through to being to a postdoc post and then into an academic career, but that's the expansion of the doctoral base was not associated with a similar expansion in jobs all the way up. Now, you do look at alternative. Well, should we have had a smaller doctoral base and put more money into higher level careers? But actually, I do think doctorates, people with doctorates going out into industry, going out into business, going out to do other things is difficult. So the pyramid is just a rather different shape than it used to be. And I think probably, and this is true of academia, there are people who are in postdoc positions in academia trying to get into a research career for whom sadly there probably just is not space in our current dispensation. And it should be possible for those with honor and with distinction and with success to do other things as well.
Yeah, and I think you could argue that having people with the right sort of PhD background going into industry is a very good thing. And a smattering of those in more traditional research and development labs could be very good for industry, I think. Although if they're passionate about their science and want to stay doing it, then that doesn't sound so good for them, I understand. Rich Walker has come back with a bit more expansion of his point, which is that in some technology areas, it's easy for the national lab to position itself as the gatekeeper, soak up the innovation funding and prevent SMEs from accessing it. On the other side, Innovate UK allows 30% for research partners, which means one catapult or university.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And yeah, that's it. I'll take that away. I mean, I have no responsibility in this area, because it's not that these public sector research establishments are in general, I mean, some of them are part of UKRI, but some of them are not. How this is really where Patrick Valence's excellent work on our sort of public science infrastructure through our national labs, I think can, we need to protect them more, but also expect them in turn not to act in the way that Rich Walker is describing.
Now, I have another one from anonymous attendee. It's difficult to know whether it's the same anonymous attendee or a different one, but I suspect it may be the mystery person, maybe the same. And the question is, how can UK PLC capture more innovation funding from companies to partner with our research expertise? And that came out in your numbers, that we're behind the curve on that, broadening out beyond government funding.
Yeah, and this is the key issue. And this is my friendly advice to everyone in the research community over the next 6 months, because the public spending review is going to be crucial. And let's face it, it's marvellous the government has got the target of 2.4% R&D. We have been stuck on 1.7% and have not really been moving for a long time. And the CSR is our last chance to do it. The Treasury will be expecting a significant element of that increase in R&D to come from the private sector. The challenge is to make sure that, well, the challenge is to design proposals for increased public investment that clearly crowd in private investment. The Treasury will play quite hardball and just say, well, with some new tax release, we can get the private sector to do it. But they will be persuaded if there's robust evidence that particular public initiatives themselves promote private investment. And there is that evidence, there is that research on some particular programs, particularly run by Innovate UK in the past. I set up, encouraged by the research community, catalyst funds, which have done a fantastic job, particularly the main one, the large one, though I always hoped it'd be succeeded by others, the biotech catalyst, which aligned MRC funding and Innovate UK funding, and has led to a surge in the number of life science companies and industrial innovation there. But I don't think that's the only way of doing it. And so we should be putting our efforts into drawing on the evidence so far from previous appraisals or previous programs, and thinking about new ones for the future as to how we can design public programs that promote private spending. And I think it's one of the great appeals of the Catapults. Their whole funding model, where they're exposed to get private funding alongside public funding, is another way of using them to of promoting R&D. And we have, of course, also our co-funding of capital projects for research, the old RPIF program, which I introduced, where universities bid for money for physical capital infrastructure, but are expected to find external partners. They could be charities or commercial players that will come in alongside to co-fund, and the companies like seeing government with skin in the game as well. So effective, well-evidenced schemes for public money to promote private money is the best way of getting a good settlement for science in the next public spending round.
Absolutely. Very interesting, thoughtful question from Kieran Flanagan. Thanks for interesting talk. Kieran spent the last year reading histories of US and UK Cold War science. One of the differences seems to him that much defence investment in the US went into universities with major spillovers in terms of advanced training and research, whilst in the UK it went into defence research establishments which were inherently secretive, had little exchange with universities and few links to advanced training. What does this observation mean for your observations regarding PSREs and the new security imperative?
That is a very interesting point, and it's great that that Kieran is joining our discussion this evening. It's a very interesting point, and of course, the original Vannevar Bush proposal to President Truman, he is explicit that this continuing national effort in science and technology should be university based, but America ended up with a more diverse network than Bush proposed, because the departments held on to and protected their national labs. They weren't going to let it all go to universities, and so we have Livermore and all those, that Argonne and all that fantastic network. But the point that defense research establishment can be secretive, I think, is very fair. And there is undoubtedly, I would say, following this new interest of security agencies in science and technology is net a good thing, but it does have some downsides and risks. And one of them is key discussions about funding taking place in relatively small groups of people with high levels of security clearance, and classic civil technology experts not being in the room, which is a version, I think, of the anxiety that Kieran's bringing out. So yes, if there is to be an increased security role, finding ways in which it spreads out beyond the necessary secretive establishments is a really important challenge. And you could argue that GCHQ historically is an example of exactly what Kieran is worried about, but nowadays there's definitely making more of an effort to ensure that some of their work can also be commercialized.
Great. I think we've pulled up most of the questions. One or two people, I hope they won't mind, I've left one side because there were more statements than questions. I would like, rather selfishly at the end, to ask my question. And nobody can stop me, which is great. And that is really about, as you will know, David, the Babbage endeavour is trying to bring together the diverse expertise, such as it is, from economics, engineering and operations, to inform industrial policy making in a more coherent way. I don't need to tell you that those disciplines traditionally are heavily siloed. Now, I know the term industrial policy comes in and out of fashion, but of course, all governments are deciding what to do with respect to industry. So it exists, whether you call it that or not. Do you have views going forward about ways we might enhance the, I was going to say multidisciplinarity, but I don't like the word, but you know what I mean, a more diverse input to the process of industrial policy formation than we have had hitherto?
That is a very good question, Mike. And it is and of course, it was one of the original reasons why Paul Nurse wanted UKRI to be set up, to promote more multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary working. I personally think that there are a host of other factors at play here, some of them which I have to say are university-based. The structure of subjects which students want to study has quite a big impact on the way in which universities organize themselves. So you paradoxically, especially in the UK, have kind of subject choices of teenagers having quite a big impact on the shape of our research effort, because all the academics that are brought in to teach them also wish to do research. An interesting way of deciding your research priorities, but no worse than many others. Then you've also got the structure of academic journals, and sometimes the difficulty of having the prestige still tends to be associated with some relatively narrowly focused journals, because appraising a more interdisciplinary piece of work is often harder. But I detect in the last few years, I may be over optimistic here, but certainly the research councils, I hope partly prompted by UKRI, doing more co-funding. A lot of them will say, for example, that a technology is really having an impact when actual humans are using it, and understanding human behavior and how it interacts with humans is therefore crucial. And so social science really matters. Everything from getting people actually to take a jab. We can see fascinating issues about, it's not just a matter of doing the fantastic work in the labs, which we've seen done in the UK and elsewhere. So I'm detecting a greater appreciation of the value of interdisciplinarity. I think probably having journals and departments that are interdisciplinary would be a really good further step. Of course, there are interdisciplinary journals, but prestigious, highly valued ones, I think, is probably another important step. And how we at UKRI dispense our funding in ways, it's part of the case for the mission strand in what we do, bringing together different disciplines so that you've got a social science input on a humanities input from early on.
And finally, the process by which policies are formed and informed, are we there getting enough of this multidisciplinary advice in that process, which I know is to some extent chaotic and organic?
Well, I think, oddly enough, it's part of the argument for technologies. I think Whitehall, and it's reviving now, but both has got quite a good system for technology appraisal. My original 8 great technologies wasn't sort of my personal view of the world. It was my layman's distillation of work that had been done by the Government Chief Scientist's Office, by Innovate UK. And now the Government Chief Scientist is playing a major role and others. So technology appraisal is quite broad. Paradoxically, it's sometimes the discussion of missions which can, by contrast, seem quite amateurish and don't bring together the underpinning knowledge of where we are on key technologies, which makes shaping a mission credible or not. But I would say, in the last year or so, there has been a noticeable step change, as I say, paradoxically driven above all by security concerns, but to some extent by place and by the government's belief that global Britain has to really be still punching its weight on R&D, and if anything, should be doing even more. I think there is more of that than before. And so the Royal Academy of Engineering, thinking of your interest, Mike, the Royal Academy of Engineering is one of the key bodies being consulted by the government as Kwasi Kwarteng develops his excellent innovation plan. As I say, Innovate UK has now got a new CEO and can move forward, though of course Ian Campbell, his predecessor as acting CEO, did a fantastic job. So yes, I feel a bit more optimistic about these conversations happening. The key problem, which is touched on in Kieran Flanagan's observation, is ensuring that there are places where people with a security focus and civil experts with a commercial or non-military focus, ensuring they can interact. I think that's the big current challenge.
Fascinating. David, thank you for an absolutely great evening. Thanks to our audience who sent in some jolly interesting questions, but particularly thanks to you for a most insightful and authoritative set of answers and for framing the conversation so beautifully. We're very grateful for your time and look forward to seeing you maybe as an attendee next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very, very, very enjoyable. Thanks.
Thank you.